This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Wim Zwijnenburg. He works for Pax for Peace and he concentrates on conflict and the environment, specifically trying to work out via field visits and research how to protect the environment when war is all around, infecting people, destroying things and making things a lot harder for people to live. As usual, if you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/popularfront. Or there are other ways. You can go to popularfront.co/support. Please excuse my voice. I'm unwell and sound like I've been smoking crack, but I haven't. I think the best thing, maybe you can describe what it is you actually do.
So I work for a Dutch peace organization called PAX, and the work we do is focused on peace building and conflict resolution. And around 10 years ago, our partners in Iraq, we work with a lot of local partners in over 15 different conflict areas. They were raising concerns over the pollution caused by the war and the potential impact it had on their health. In particular, depleted uranium emissions that were used by the US. So we started looking into that and traveling to southern Iraq and doing field research, because there's a lot of different kind of sources of information on this topic, especially around DU. There are like activists claiming it causes like a nuclear holocaust in the Middle East, and the other side there's the US government saying there's no problem at all. So we were trying to find out like what is the issue here. And in the course of our work, our field work in southern Iraq, we talk with Iraqi ministries, with like demining agencies, with health experts, doctors, communities that lived by contaminated military scrap metal sites. And we sort of, came across other types of environmental pollution and impact that could have been linked with like health concerns from local communities. And together with the partners we were working with in the UK, we started to look at, okay, what is the wider impact of conflict on the environment and what are the implications for the health of people in the short term, but also in the long term. So that's part of the work we're doing at the moment. And in the course of that work, we found out like hardly anyone is paying attention to that. So to the environmental damage and pollution caused by conflicts and what are like the health risk for communities, what are the socioeconomic impacts. And so we started to explore that, and it was very difficult in the beginning because, as I said, like no one is actually doing this kind of work. There's the UN Environment who does post-conflict environmental assessments, but often those are limited because of funding issues or because of security issues, or it's done too late. So for example, in Sierra Leone, it was conducted, I think, around 5-6 years after the conflict. So in the meantime, people were still getting exposed to a range of pollution sources. So one of the issues we've come across is because nobody sort of paying attention to this, and partly this was because if you talk about the environment, people think you're some kind of tree-hugging hippie while you're talking about the environment in war. Like, and often you get comments like, what are you going to do, like separate garbage or something? And of course, like to some extent that is understandable, but it is sort of been low-hanging priority for a lot of organizations and governments, until people actually start complaining about their health problems, and those complaints are result in conflicts with local authorities because their issues from local communities are not being addressed. Once your water is polluted, once your children are getting sick, and you see all this stuff around you, and you don't know where it's coming from and who's going to clean it up and what the health effects are, of course people are getting concerned. So that's one thing, and the other thing is also in the humanitarian sector. So like a lot of humanitarian response organizations, they've come across these issues as well. So when states in warfare, they target critical infrastructure like water, sewage facilities, water filtration plants, there's already an impact there as well, because people don't have access to clean water, so there's polluted water, so there's outbreak of communicable diseases, which also impacts humanitarian response. And another example is that, especially in urban conflicts, there are a lot of sites in or nearby urban areas, factories, chemical plants. Once you target them, it also results in a release of a range of toxics and other hazardous chemicals, which can affect local population if this not being addressed. A good case would be in Iraq, where the US targeted around 40 sites in their air campaign in 2003, which UN Environment then had to identify and work with the Iraqi government to support remediation efforts. So, but yeah, so there's still a huge gap in collecting information on all the different vectors and angles in conflicts, how this can affect the environment and in result can affect the health of people. So that's what we've been working on in the last couple of years on how to improve that.
So give me an example of what you do when you do this field work, because a lot of organizations that talk about this stuff don't really go and do anything anywhere. I find a lot of the time they're kind of looking at data sets, but you actually go out into the field and you see what's going on, right? Like, for example, you were telling me there's a situation in the Donbass in Ukraine because of the war and stuff like that.
Yeah, so it's a very good example. Those are very good examples of where you need to verify. So what we start to do, we start to use open source information because it's very difficult to get access to an area, especially when there's a hot conflict, and find out what's going on there. So that's the work that has been done by Bellingcat provided a lot of entry points for data collection. So we started doing that, like looking at open source databases from prior to the conflict, to satellite monitoring, to social media monitoring, and trying to cross-verify. Okay, we know from Wikimapia that there's a chemical plant here, and then we look at live UA map and we see there's been shelling around this chemical plant. So and then we look at other tools to find out, okay, if this is a phenol factory, for example, what is phenol, what kind of, how dangerous is it to human health? And this is an example from the Donbass. So we start to map all these sites in the Donbass where you have like major livestock facilities where they have like 100,000 pigs and 100,000 chickens, and they create a lot of like waste, and they have like huge waste ponds where all these, basically all the excrements are being collected, and the wastewater, which is also mixed with a lot of, so you have a lot of medications that's in there. The animals are being fed, or like other kinds of pollutants are getting to the wastewater, and those were on the front line. So, but it's difficult to tell that story. So you want to show to people like why these environmental tinderboxes are relevant to monitor and identifying conflicts. And in order to do that, you have to go there and show what situation looks like on the ground. So that's why we went to the Donbass after we collected the information, trying to talk with people, with local communities. And so, for example, I gave you the example of the phenol factory, which is like literally on the front line in Novorossiysk. It's north of Donetsk. And what we saw there is there's a major toxic waste pond between the Ukrainian army lines and the Russian-backed separatist lines. And it have been shelling from both sides, and at some point, like they had to intervene, or the international community was sort of intervening, saying, hey, if this goes wrong, if the artillery shell hits the toxic waste pond, you have 300,000 cubical liters of highly toxic waste flowing into the river, making all groundwater use in the whole region impossible.
And how did that end up there, though? How did there end up being this toxic waste pond?
So there's a phenol factory nearby. So phenol was sort of the byproduct from stone coal. So the Donbass is, in the Soviet time, and even prior to that, like they started using a lot of extraction of coal for the industry, and the byproduct of the coal is phenol, which is being used in all kind of, is highly flammable, and it's being used in all kind of products in paint and other kind of products. But there's in the process of making the phenol, you have also a waste product, which is also toxic, but you can't use it. So they need to store that, and then it needs to be processed in order to get rid of it in a safe way. But of course, the conflict, it was already there before the conflict, but they still use the location to safely store all the phenol waste water. And what you saw there is like the Ukrainian army dug in their trenches next to the toxic waste pond. And when we went there and we talked with the Ukrainian army, first of all, the guy just came in and he didn't know there was a waste pond then, because there was just a change of regiments coming in every, I think they change every couple of weeks. And the guy who just came in had no idea there was one. So people are not informed about what's actually on their front lines. But then another guy who was there for a longer time came in and he started talking about this, saying, well, yeah, if we put our trenches there, we know that the opposition are not going to fire at us, because if they miss and hit the waste pond, then they'll be fucked too. Basically boils down to that. But on the other hand, they said if we don't do that, they will dig their trenches next to the waste pond, because they know that we can't fire at them. So it creates sort of Ukrainian standoff, if you will. It's a highly industrialized environment in the Donbass. You have all these Soviet era chemical factories. There are a lot of mines, abandoned mines, where radioactive materials and other chemical materials is being stored. And for example, there's also a big issue in the Donbass, like the waste, they store all these radioactive materials and chemical materials in those mines, but the pumping systems are often failing. So naturally, groundwater is sipping into the mines, and the groundwater is being pumped out of those abandoned mines. But now the water infrastructure is failing, so the mines are flooding. So in worst case, all the radioactive and chemical materials are flooding out of the mines if it gets into the water and can contaminate the local area. And this has been repeatedly been warned for. So that's also an impact of conflict, where you have to deal with all this toxic and radioactive waste from decades ago, and you have to do it in a sustainable way, but you can't, because everybody's fighting, and there's no governance or control on what's happening with those sites.
Yeah, and this might sound really weird, but it just occurred to me. I remember when I was in the Donbass last, and I think I was near Zaitsevo or somewhere near there, and I was like, hey, I need a piss. And them, the separatists being the separatists, were like, you can't piss over there, even though the whole place is wrecked. They were like, you got to use the toilet. I was like, right, well, where's the toilet? And they were like, over there. And so I walked over, and I remember just kind of moving this bit of scrap metal that was kind of set up in this cabin kind of way. And the toilet basically was just, I don't know, it was like a 10, 20 foot hole dug really deep with just, you can imagine, everyone's going for a shit there, piss, everything. Now, I know that's just human waste, but I remember even then thinking that cannot be good. Think how many front lines there are. Think how many trenches, I mean, do you think even that the soldiers themselves are going to end up polluting the ground like that?
With human waste or human excrement, it's sort of, I mean, you shouldn't fall into the waste pit. Let me put it that way. But I think that's not that bad, because you can also use human waste for as a fertilizer as well. It's being done. But if you have 300,000 liters of human waste stored somewhere and that's being hit, yeah, that's there's a lot of ammonia, a lot of methane in it that's naturally collected in that's also with the livestock as well. There's a lot of ammonia in there, which can, if that gets released in one flush, then definitely it's not healthy for the local environment. But also it points out to another issue. So for treating human waste, there's or water filtration, there's a lot of chlorine needed. So in the case of Donetsk, there was a lot of discussion around targeting of water filtration stations, because a lot of chlorine was stored there. So you saw, for example, a couple of examples where the Russian-backed separatists were firing at filtration sites storing 6,000 liters of chlorine, which is used for water filtration. Or they put up artillery next to a larger site where there was a lot of, even more, on top of my head, I'm not sure, but it was triple times amount of chlorine stored there. And they know the Ukrainian army wouldn't fire back at them, because if they missed and hit the water filtration site, then it would be like a major chemical incident. So those are just like a couple of examples, but like, yeah, I've been in another issue with, like, lately I was in November in northeast Syria. So in Syria we started mapping the increase of artisanal refineries. So for example, after 2012, when the revolution ended up in a violent conflict, a lot of engineers at the oil fields like fled their jobs or were killed or joined armed groups. Still, there was a big need for oil and oil refining. So people living nearby in the villages, they started to buy the crude oil and start to refine the crude oil themselves, which in a makeshift refinery, sort of backyard burners. And this practice starts spreading all over northeast Syria in the following years. But those refineries are highly like hazardous working sites. There are a lot of explosions. There's they're basically what they do is they start cooking crude oil, and that sort of distill the crude oil through a small pipeline in a water basin, and then the refined product come out, which might be benzene or diesel. And yeah, and we started looking at the satellite images and start counting all those refineries over the course of the couple of years. And there have been literally tens and tens of thousands of those refineries spreading to all over northeast Syria. And from anecdotal evidence we were getting from the ground was like a lot of children were working in those conditions. And so we wanted to see like how is this being dealt with. So in November we went to Hasaka and in the northeast Syria. It's in the Al Jazeera canton, the Kurdish-controlled areas, also known as Rojava, and those issues were on the agenda there of the local, of the self-administration, and they closed down all the artisanal refineries on apart from a couple of locations. But they were struggling a lot because, like, we went to visit some of the sites that were still operational, and if you talk with villagers, or people working at the site, they basically said like, well, we have no other source of income, so we have to work in those toxic conditions because we have to provide for our families, and agriculture doesn't provide us with enough income. So that's why we start doing this, and that's also a byproduct because also in 2014 the US and the US-led coalition and the Russians start targeting oil refineries. So there was no other way of refining crude oil, and ISIS was making a lot of money from refining. So to some extent, it's understandable that you engage in these kind of military tactics, but the unforeseen consequences was a major rise of a toxic industry where thousands and thousands of civilians, including a lot of children, were working in, exposing them on a daily basis to like noxious fumes and toxic substances. And there are horrifying images and videos available from interviews where people tell them about their stories. So, and we wanted to document that and show, okay, this is also, it not only does it affect directly the health of those working in those refineries, but it also in the long term create a lot of localized pollution. So all the wastewater is going down in the local rivers. People were complaining around that as well, like local water sources were not usable anymore, or the quality was severely diminished. So in the long term, if you want to look at rehabilitation and reconstruction, those environmental factors are going to be hugely important, because if they can't return to an area because their local area is contaminated or because of the pollution, it's difficult to start your life and restructure your socioeconomic opportunities again. Then it also takes away an opportunity for people to rebuild their lives after conflict. And in particular, in a world where I think there are less natural resources, so having access to quality natural resources and a healthy environment is becoming more of an issue, and conflicts only lead to more destruction of those scarcely resources we have left. So I think we should, like, the environment deserves a high priority in understanding conflict dynamics.
Right, and when you're out there, do you suggest ways to help them? I imagine there's not a lot you can really do, all the way in Syria.
So in Yeah, in the case of Syria, so we met with the local self-administration, and that was kind of interesting because they were really happy when we raised the issues, because they said like, well, no one, for us it's a major issue. In the case of Rojava, it's also difficult, not difficult, but it's different because there's a lot of focus on ecology in the ideology of the self-administration. And that was helpful because they were quite happy that we addressed this, because they felt like, yeah, no one's listening to us and nobody's understanding this while we're having major issues here. And also because the position the of the self-administration resulted in that they can't import. It's difficult for them to import equipment or goods or expertise to rebuild the oil industry, which is like a major source of income to them. And it's not necessarily that they want to have this big oil industry, but for them they're dependent on it. But they can't do it in such a way that it's less polluting. So because of the blockade, so they can't get any equipment in from either from Iraq or from other parts of Syria. And so that was an issue they were struggling with. They were also struggling with agriculture, which has been also like, Hasaka is the breadbasket of Syria. And ISIS destroyed a lot of water infrastructure like irrigation, pumping systems. And it's also difficult for them to import those kind of materials. So the land quality was diminishing. There has been a lot of deforestation. There were issues around waste, like cities like Kamishli and smaller towns like Derek and Amude, like they also create a lot of like household waste. That's something you usually won't think about in conflicts, but like what do you do with that? So they don't have safe storage sites or safe landfills where you can put all that stuff. And that's something that we're struggling with as well. So right now we're trying to also we're working with local partners in northeast Syria, local organizations, and they also address those issues with us, and we're going to work with them to identify where the most critical issues are and do interviews with people and trying to highlight these concerns. And then we collect those interviews and we collect those the surveys, and we discuss the results with the local administration, and we want to involve also international organizations and governments to demonstrate like this is an issue for local communities. They want to rebuild their lives and their livelihoods, and environmental concerns are key to them. And it's also interesting to see in Iraq, a lot of youth groups in Iraq are now addressing the environmental issues. And so, for example, in southern Iraq, in Basra, you had this massive wave of protests breaking out last summer because of the pollution from the water, and people couldn't drink the water anymore, and they were getting sick.
Oh yeah, the fish were dying and everything.
The background to that was it's multifactorial background. So there's hydropolitics with Turkey who are building dams. There's a severe drought, but it's also failure from the national government to fix the damaged water infrastructure. There's the increased salinization because of the rising sea. So that sort of all resulted in this sort of perfect storm in Basra, but that's where you can see like environmental conditions can also give room for political tensions between communities who are disgruntled with their lack of government action, and they're getting sick and nobody's doing something about it because they can't drink their water anymore. So if you don't address that, then it can result in tensions. And that's where we're seeing now in Iraq a lot of youth groups, like worldwide we see youth groups, because it's about their future, standing up and then protesting and demanding action from governments to do something about this. And that's something hopeful I see in the Middle East, where a lot of young people are taking the streets or forming activist groups or committees or organizing demonstrations to demand accountability from their governments to address the environmental issues. And especially water in the Middle East is going to be a huge thing. So that's something we want to support in helping local organizations in identifying those issues and giving voice to their concerns also in the international community, and providing them with a platform where they can speak, and it's up to the international community and states to support those cries for help to address those issues.
Sure. Before we were speaking about this thing with Iran basically setting fires by trying to chase the PKK out the mountains.
Yeah, so the last summer there were huge outbreaks of wildfires in northeast Iraq, west Iran, and southern Turkey. So along in the borderlands between Turkey and Iraq and Iran, you have the PKK in the Kandil Mountains, and you have the Iranian armed opposition, Kurdish armed opposition, also in the Kandil Mountains next to the PKK, and that's why they organize themselves, and they're being targeted by the Iranians and by the Turks on a regular basis. So last summer it was a very dry summer, so the Turkish military, but also the Iranian border forces were striking those campsites or suspected militants in those areas. And of course, because it is very dry, it's a mountainous area, so there was a lot of wildfires destroying like forestry and woodlands, and also encroaching upon villages, and people had to flee, and environmentalists who were fighting the wildfires were also died in the fires. And it was, I think, the biggest this summer. It happened before, where it's also likely been used as deliberate tactic. So we heard from, at least it was reported in Iran, that Iranian snipers using tracer rounds to set the area on fire, because it's very dry, and with a tracer round it makes it also like a tinderbox there. So it destroys also like the local communities, orchards. People are drifting out of their villages, and it was a big issue there as well, where you use the environment as a sort of weapon to attack armed groups. So that's just one of the many examples, but it could also be the other way around. So, for example, in Colombia, during the FARC era, it wasn't possible for logging companies to chop down the woods because of the presence of the FARC in those areas, or other paramilitary groups. And I think the ELZN, is that the one in Colombia?
No, that's in Mexico.
That's Mexico. Yeah, there's another left-wing group next to besides the FARC in Colombia.
The FLN.
Yeah, FLN. So after the peace accord in a couple of years ago, it provided also an opportunity for logging companies to also chop down the forest there. So there was a massive increase of deforestation taking place after the conflict, because the conflict sort of prevented the forestry from being cut down. So that's another, it can also be the other way around. But you also see in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is cutting down forests because they use charcoal trade for income generation to fund their armed group. In Idlib, we haven't confirmed it yet, but like there has been massive deforestation as well by armed groups who use charcoal for income generation and the charcoal trade. But also you have issues around, even on peacetime, with military activities. So in the US, for example, there are like 39,000 contaminated military sites from military pollutants, from firing ranges, chemicals being used as in fire extinguishers on a massive scale, and local communities as well. Like the drinking water was affected. People were getting sick, and people were being exposed to military toxics. So there are a lot of questions there around military responsibility for pollution and damage, and people actually getting sick from being exposed to that.
To be honest, I'm really personally very interested in environmental issues, but I'm very cynical. When this kind of, let's stop having straws in Europe, I thought, yeah, way too late. And now talking to you about this, again, I just think surely it's way too late to actually fix any of this. Like we've destroyed everything way too much already, no? Like it's going to take a radical difference, it feels.
Well, we can't change the past anymore, but we can influence the future. So the best thing we can do is to look at the past and see what we can fix there on the damage that's being done, and what we can do is prevent that more damages will be done in the near future. So in the way, what we're trying to do is to address those issues, put this on the agenda of armed forces, and there's a growing understanding also among the militaries that what the limitations are and what kind of limitations you put in place, but also for reconstruction to focus on the environment, because it's in everyone's interest to prevent unnecessary damage. And let's be honest, like, we can't stop wars. That's not going to happen. Like, there won't be a peaceful future, and wars will always happen. What we can do is trying to make sure if those are being fought, then that civilians and their livelihoods are not being affected, and we have to engage with those who are open to that kind of message. I can't stop, just like the law won't stop a criminal from stealing something or from killing someone. It does stop a lot of other people or it has a preventive effect on many other people do that kind of stuff. So that's the same with international regulation as well. We can address those issues, put it on the agenda, and at least trying to make sure if something bad happens, that now there will be monies being made available to quickly remediate contaminated sites, to make sure people are not being exposed to, or civilians are not being exposed to hazardous substances, or that money is being or expertise is being put into remediation of damaged environmental sites or environmental infrastructure is being fixed in a rapid pace. So in the long term, it doesn't have a big impact on health and the socioeconomic opportunities for societies recovering from armed conflict. So that's sort of the least you can do. I always feel like I can't change the future to something better, but we have to take the responsibilities that we have and what we can do, and try to act accordingly to those responsibilities to make things better and not give up, basically, because then the other side has already won, and that's a matter of principle that I don't want to accept. In the last couple of years, we also have been working with humanitarian agencies and UN agencies to improve response to environmental damage that occurred in conflict by collecting data on damage to industrial sites, damage to environmental sensitive sites, and trying to find a method in data collection and identification and monitoring of conflict pollution and environmental damage. So this data is being collected and shared among humanitarian agencies in conflict areas, so they know what they come across, and they will know how to deal with this and incorporate those environmental dimensions in the humanitarian response planning. So that's one area where significant progress has been made, and that should lead to hopefully minimizing health risk for civilians in conflicts. And next, because this data is then made available, it can also be helpful in post-conflict reconstruction for relevant local or national authorities to look at where environmental hotspots are, and include that in their reconstruction work and cleanup work, so local communities don't have to deal with the impact of the conflict on their local environment. So that's on the practical side. And on the policy side, there also have been an increasing number of really interesting debates within the UN. So, for example, the United Nations Environmental Assembly has two resolutions, and one in 2016 on protection of the environment in areas affected by armed conflict, and in 2017 they had a resolution on mitigating risk from conflict pollution. And those kind of resolutions have both been very helpful in the sense that the first resolution on protection of the environment also gave an enormous boost to the legal process in the UN. So there's been a debate in the UN on legal protection of the environment in times of armed conflict. So the International Law Committee has set up, have been working over the last 8 years on discussing draft principles on improving protection of the environment in armed conflict. And this resolution was very helpful in that. And the other resolution on conflict pollution resulted in support to the Iraqi government in training local employees or employees from the Ministry of Environment on detecting pollution in areas that were affected by ISIS. So there was massive oil pollution in Gayara in Iraq, where 19 oil wells have been put on fire, and those wells were burning for like 8 months, and like there was a lot of like smoke pollution and crude oil spills in the nearby area. And of course, people living there and IDP camps that were living that were nearby those burning oil wells, like they were living on the black clouds from that smoke. There was a sulfur factory being put on fire, and within a couple of days there was a massive release of sulfur dioxide. Around 20 people were killed by the toxic clouds, and around 1,000 people were hospitalized with breathing problems. So that also needed to be addressed, and there was a range of other oil pollution sites. And your resolution that came out of that debate in the United Nations also resulted in financial support and expertise support to the Iraqi government to deal with this issue. So those are like two concrete outcomes where advocacy work and giving voice to and providing an overview of what's happening on the ground and how environmental damage and conflict affects the environment, how it also boosted an international process. And I think that's something that we need to do more, to look at those stories and listen to those stories, because they need to be heard, and the situations on the ground need to be visualized, because that brings also with it a strong image on making it more concrete for viewers or readers and for experts and policymakers on how environmental pollution does have direct or long-term impacts on communities. And advocacy work is helpful in that regard, because it can bring those voices from affected communities to a larger stage within the UN, and it's up then to states to find an adequate answer to this emerging threat that will only become a much more bigger issue in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, true. We've at least got to try. I could talk to you about this all day, but I know you've got to go. Where can people get hold of your work? Where can they follow what you're doing? I think it's really important work, and I think people should know more about it.
So, yeah, thanks at least also for having us and talk about this. I think it's also an important issue that journalists and other people should be more aware of and use in their work. And if you want to learn more about this, you can also always visit our website, www.paxforpeace.nl. We're also doing a lot of publications on using open source information on environmental damage and conflicts on bellingcat.com. And PAX is also a member of the Toxic Remnants of War Network, which is www.trwn.org, where you also find a wealth of information on all the different dimensions of environmental damage and armed conflict. And feel free to drop me a line, or you can follow me on Twitter at Wamez, WAWMEZZ. Yeah, and thanks again for paying attention to this issue, Jake, and much appreciated.
I'm glad someone's doing something about it. So that was Wim Zwijnenburg talking about the many ways that war kills the environment, and how you don't really ever find out about that until it's too late, years after the war often. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/popularfront. We are grassroots independent all the way, so that's the only real way we kind of get moving. So yeah, consider supporting us on the Patreon, or with a one-time donation or Bitcoin, whatever. Go to popularfront.co/support. You'll find out how to do that there. Please do forgive my voice. I sound like I've been absolutely caning it. I haven't, I'm just unwell. This episode is sponsored by thedefensepost.com, defense with an S. Go to them for your regular updates on the world in conflict. If you want to watch Popular Front documentaries, go to youtube.com/popularfront, subscribe, hit the bell, all of that. We've got a lot of video content coming soon. You'll see the new Ukraine anarchist doc is either out now or will be out very shortly after this episode. Follow us on Instagram, that's instagram.com/popular.front, or follow us on Twitter, that's twitter.com/popularfrontco, or follow me, that's at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. Thank you very much to the following people. Without you, this would not be possible. Those people are Darby, Adam Bergschneider, Axel Iverson, Chad Walker, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Diana Gorvanek, Elizabeth Benicki, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, James from the Discord, Joanne Stocker, Joel Tambusi, Kyle Payne, Lawrence Abrahams, LH, Margaret Bowling, Michael Euler, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormack from What Bitcoin Did, Russia Al-Akidi, Ryan Sandercock, Skatu Music, Scott Jonesy, Sebastian from the Discord, Surishe Hawazi, Teddy, Tom Lochrin, Tony Bin, Vida Provost, Zachary Hinch, and Anthony Kabarak. Thank you very, very much. If you want to support, you want the bonus episode, Discord, all of that stuff, go to patreon.com/popularfront. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Cramped Skunkman. Go to his Bandcamp, that's crampedskunkman.bandcamp.com. Check his music out.